Hey, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
On the last episode, we started a short little series talking about cognitive functions, and particularly the decision-making, or what's technically called the judging functions that we all use in our different personalities, our different Myers-Briggs personalities. And in the last podcast, we talked about the two cognitive functions that all thinkers use to make decisions. The one was introverted thinking, which we've nicknamed here at Personality Hacker as accuracy. The other one was extroverted thinking, which we've nicknamed here at Personality Hacker as effectiveness. Now, we mentioned this in the last podcast that this is a little bit more deeper content than we normally would talk about on the podcast. We every once in a while go into a little bit deeper frame on some of this stuff around personality types. But if you're a new listener, don't get discouraged. All the podcasts aren't this deep dive. There's a lot of topical, personal growth-oriented podcasts, or a lot of access for beginners around Myers-Briggs and other personality typology systems, so don't get overwhelmed. And on today's podcast, we're going to go into the two feeler judging functions that all feelers in the Myers-Briggs systems use, which is extroverted feeling, which we've nicknamed here as harmony, or introverted feeling, which we've nicknamed here as authenticity.
So we're going to make some assumptions about, before we start this podcast, we're going to make the assumptions that you're familiar with cognitive functions and you're familiar with judging functions or the judging processes enough to be able to understand a little bit about what these two fundamentally are. And we're going to talk about the differences between the two, compare and contrast them, because even if you're familiar with Myers-Briggs and familiar with cognitive functions, sometimes the differences between these two processes can get confusing. One can look like the other. And if you're trying to figure out your best fit type, or if you're trying to profile somebody in your life that you love, or even just figure out what the difference is between how you use your feeling process versus somebody in your life that also uses a feeling process, getting some of these more nuanced differences down can be extremely helpful. And so we want to do a bit of a deeper dive into these two processes, compare, contrast, like we did last week with the two thinking processes. Now, just like we mentioned last week, all feelers have a thinking process, right? And we talk a little bit, we just kind of mentioned this concept of polarities. Polarities are when two cognitive functions, well, basically, they each have an opposite to themselves, and it's the contrast or sort of the relationship that they have with their opposite that creates a whole polarity. So all of the feeling processes have a thinking process that's attached to it and create a polarity. Now, we'll talk about polarities at another time, but right now we just want to remind you that even if you're a feeler, that doesn't mean that you don't also have a thinking element to you. And that's going to show up in different, basically different elements of your life. And those of you that are thinkers have a feeling part of you. So if you listened to last week's and you, as a thinker, got some deeper dive into how your thinking process works, this might be interesting to you because you'll get a deeper dive into how your feeling process works, even if it's only in the 10-year-old or tertiary process or the 3-year-old inferior process.
I want to make a quick comment on that, just so someone that has enough information that you might be getting confused. When we talk about this idea of a polarity where there's an opposite, today we're getting ready to launch into the two feeler functions. We're going to talk about introverted feeling and extroverted feeling, and that is not what we're talking about here. Those are not, seemingly those could be looked at maybe as opposites, but they're not. They're on a spectrum of introversion or extroversion. In other words, where you focus the feeling nature that you have. So it's not so much those are the polarities we talk about. That's actually something completely separate from this conversation. I just want to make that quick note to add some clarity.
Thank you. I would have not made that level of clarity, probably. I would have just assumed they know where we were talking about. So I appreciate that. So we'll probably do a lot of, just like we said last week, because we established some basic concepts in the last podcast. So my recommendation is that you listen to that podcast first, because we're going to do a lot of referencing to some of the things that we established there. But one of the things we talked about is this concept called attitudes. Each of the cognitive functions lives in a different attitude or world that are technically called extroverted or introverted attitudes. Extroverted attitude is the outer world. It's the world external of us, outside of ourselves. And an introverted attitude is internal. It's something that occupies the world inside of ourselves. So the feeling processes are split between one that is pointed towards an external or extroverted attitude, that's extroverted feeling, what we've nicknamed harmony, And then there's introverted feeling, has an introverted attitude and what we call authenticity. So the attitude or the direction or world that these judging processes are focused on really changes the nature of how the process works itself. It changes what it's interested in, what it's focused on, the kinds of things it's measuring, the kinds of things that capture its attention, and the ultimate evaluative criteria it uses to determine what we should be doing as people. These are our decision-making criteria. So extroverted feeling has very different criteria than introverted feeling, even though they're both feeling processes. There's a similarity in them being feeling processes in the sense that they both look at personal criteria to make their decisions. They're both very interested in how things are impacting humans. But the flavor of what they're interested in and how things are impacting humans takes a little bit of a different tack based on which world it's focused upon.
Let's talk about harmony, or the technical name is extroverted feeling. Let's talk about that first. It's in the outer world. It's something that we can observe a little bit more from an external standpoint and seeing how this plays out maybe in your life. You know somebody that uses this process, or maybe you use this process yourself. Extroverted feeling is interested in creating a harmonious environment. It's about the connection point between humans. It's about getting needs met. It's about making sure that we are all living in, the word harmony really works out here, because living in harmony among each other. It's interested in what the group is feeling. It's interested in what the group is feeling sometimes is more important than what the person is feeling to an extroverted feeling person, because the group is really where the measurement, or what those should statements like Antonia just said, are being made. So this is very much in tune with things like the hierarchy or status of people in a room or in a social setting. It's very interested in social dynamics, the interplay between people, how people are getting along, breakdown of communication, all the different aspects of what you would classically see as basically social dynamics in a situation. This is what extroverted feeling really loves to pay attention to.
So I didn't mention it before, but extroverted feeling is the judging process for all FJs in the Myers-Briggs system.
Correct.
So all people who in the 4-letter code have an F and a J are using extroverted feeling as either their dominant or driver or auxiliary co-pilot process.
And in contrast, everybody with an FP in their Myers-Briggs code, that 4-letter code, is using introverted feeling.
Exactly. So why would extroverted feeling or harmony be interested in things like status? Like, why is that interesting to it? Why are social dynamics so important to somebody who uses this process? Why are they paying attention to that? And the answer is, it's basically extrapolated from its core foundational desire, which is to get people's needs met. And that makes sense. If you are tapped into other people's emotional experience because you're using your feeling process to go outward, your feeling process is basically has these tentacle or feelers out for other emotional expressions and other emotional experiences. And it's in real time. It's happening right here, right now. It's tapped into what other people are experiencing in the moment. What are their feelings about the situation? And things like room culture and status and how people feel about each other are all going to impact us on a personal level. If we walk into the room and we are the highest status person in the room, that feels very different than if we're the lowest status person in the room. Now, that doesn't mean that extroverted feeling is necessarily, once it sees these cultural status structures, it's not necessarily informing what the individual will do about it. That's up to the individual, how they'll respond to it. They might be somebody who has a real, desire to make people who are at the bottom of the totem pole, quote unquote, to feel better. So that might encourage them to reach out to that person and make them feel more comfortable. Or they might be the kind of person who wants to experience that feeling themselves, and they think that being high status is something that would really actually be good for themselves and the room, right? If they're high status, they're able to make people feel a certain emotion and feel better. So they might be more focused to tie in with that group. What the individual ends up doing with that information is based on their own personal value structure, but they are tapped into it because that is something that something that becomes obvious to them over time. The relationships that people have with each other in the room, who's dating who likes who's involved with another person, who's upset with someone else, who's trying to pretend or hide that they're not upset and just putting on a happy face. Morale boosting. All of these things are very obvious to people who use extroverted feeling. And it's because they have their feelers out, their tentacles out for not just how one person is feeling, but how the entire group is feeling. So there's actually sort of two different things they're tapped into. The emotional outpouring that each individual person is, or expression that each individual person is bringing, and the overall feeling of the room itself takes on it's almost like its own personality. And so they're tapped into two different elements, and they're trying to influence those two elements as positively as they can.
Or at least read those two elements, and to a degree. Sometimes, depending on the maturity level of someone using this process, they are trying to influence it, but sometimes they're just trying to take their cues from those elements. They're looking around to say, I don't necessarily know what decision I'm going to make here until I know what decision the room would make collectively. And this process is very much tapped more into the energy of an emotion than the content of what's happening. So sometimes the content of what's happening actually doesn't matter as long as the energy and emotions are going up or feeling good. And if the emotions and energy are feeling good and going up, the content sometimes takes a back seat to this. So this is really the metric that extroverted feeling is using often, especially that's core fundamental essence. It's saying, is this how am I feeling right now? Is it feeling like the energy of the room and the social dynamic is going up and people are having fun and there's positivity and there's connection, there's harmony around me? I feel good about that. I'm going to keep making the decisions that are leading to more of that. Or do I feel like there's a down cycle of energy, that the harmony is actually being replaced with discord, or people aren't getting along and people aren't having fun? So I'm going to stop making the decisions that are leading toward that. I'm going to start switching my decisions to get that trajectory going back up. So it's really about the emotional trajectory of the group dynamic. Is it going up? Positive, 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 fun, 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 good connection, harmony. Yes, let's keep doing whatever decisions are making this happen. Independent of content, honestly, independent of what's actually being said or done, it's the emotion of the room or the dynamic. And if the emotion is going down, then the question is this how I want to feel? And things need to change now because I want to switch this around and create harmony once again and get the dynamics going back upward. So this is what extroverted feeling is really tapped into, almost like a trajectory or a movement of energy with emotion behind it.
There's a component here. We kind of talked about how extroverted thinking does this in the last podcast, that they are very tapped into an end result. They want to know what works. And so they're always picking up metrics, or sort of unconsciously, just sort of have their metrics tapped in to ensure that their end game is the end game that they want. And they're always looking for better and better ways to get their end game across or accomplished. And extroverted feeling also has an end game. It has the end game of making sure that people are feeling a sense of simpatico so that they will feel it. If you're tapped into other people's emotional expression, when they're feeling low, that means you're following them in that emotion. You're feeling low too. And so you don't want to feel that way. You want to feel good. So you want other people to feel good as well. So getting people's needs met become one of the ways that extroverted feeling figures out how to make people, or encourage people to feel as positively as possible. And so extroverted feeling tends to be very responsive, because people are fickle, right? One day we'll feel, or one moment we'll feel great, and in the next moment we'll feel terrible because we remembered something awful that struck us, or we'll have an experience that other people can't see, but we experienced it, and now we don't feel so good. And so extroverted feeling learns to be responsive to people's emotional expressions. They recognize that emotions are not something that you can just sort of, put pin in place or necessarily control, because a lot of people can't control their emotional expression. So the control of the emotion becomes about setting up a situation or a circumstance. It becomes about controlling the context to encourage as positive emotions as possible. And so when extroverted feeling learns the talent of being responsive and setting up environments to help sort of control the emotional experience that everybody has, they get good at creating warm, inviting environments. They get good at knowing how to maybe, put two people together that would really enjoy each other's company, or introducing people to each other, or making recommendations based on what they know about that individual. They get really good at sort of herding cats and making it so that everybody feels taken care of and they don't have to think about their needs. One of my favorite examples of a person who most likely used extroverted feeling is the character Joan in Mad Men. Joan became the office manager, and the only time they knew what Joan was doing is when she stopped doing it, because she was so effortlessly and seamlessly getting everybody's needs met that they didn't even recognize what she did until she stopped, and then it became a problem because all of these needs started going unmet and things started to break down. And that's extroverted feeling at its peak, when it is so effortlessly it appears to be effortless, but they're so seamlessly getting everybody's needs met, you don't even see it. Kind of like you don't know that the dishes are being done until they stop being done and they start piling up in the sink. It's one of those situations. When extroverted feeling is at its best, it's getting things handled and taken care of in a way that other people don't even recognize. And that is the kind of context they want to create. They want to create a context where people don't have to have that stuff on their minds. They don't have to worry about it. It's just handled. So when extroverted feeling is done at its best, you almost don't see it working. You don't see it happening because it's happening it's happening in a way where you don't have to think about it.
Now, let's talk a little bit about some way this can be hijacked. Because if you as an extroverted feeling person, or somebody in your life that's extroverted feeling, is tapped into, like we talked about, it's less about what the content is. Not that content doesn't matter, but just remember that the metric is the emotion of the room or the emotion of the situation that's happening. If you feel your emotions going up, if you feel the fun and the expression of things going up, you're going to be very agreeable to continue that cycle going up. The good feelings that you're having and the feelings of the dynamic that you're in, you're going to be much more likely to continue that on that trajectory. And if it's going down, you're going to hijack that and stop it and probably readdress it or try to change something. But this is where it can go off the rails. Let's say you're isolated away from a crowd and you're with an individual who's making you feel amazing, or even with a small group of people who are making you feel amazing, but the content isn't really in your best interest or in even an ultimate harmony's best interest. It feels good in the moment, but maybe it's going against your core values. It might be something that you temporarily, it's not that you forget it, but you get caught up in the emotion of the experience. And you may act in ways that you later on reevaluate because you were feeling really good about what was happening in the moment. So what can happen is harmony people can sometimes get hijacked without a really good barometer in the outside world to tap into, because in real time, the emotions feel amazing. And you're not really paying attention sometimes when those emotions feel really good to the content of what's happening. And you can go down roads that you might reevaluate later and say, oh, I don't know if I feel good about the actions I took or the way I supported this group, or I did what that person asked me to do. I was feeling good about it in the moment, but later on I'm realizing I don't know if that was actually my core values or who I am as a person. So now I'm reevaluating that. I don't feel good about that now, but at the time I felt good about it. So it can be very confusing for a harmony user, someone using extroverted feeling, when in the moment it feels right, it feels good, it feels like those emotions are going up, fun is happening, connections are happening, harmony is being created, and you're making choices and decisions based on that. And later on, you're like, wait a second, that actually wasn't me. That wasn't me. And this is often why a lot of harmony people or extroverted feeling people have other extroverted feeling friends that they use almost as like sidekicks for each other, to watch each other when maybe they're feeling a really positive emotion and their extroverted feeling friend says, hey, wait a second here. Remember last time you went with that person and they asked you to do this thing and you felt icky or weird about it, or this dynamic happened. Make sure this is actually you, and we're going to help kind of have your back in this. So make sure you're tied to us whenever you're going through life, because this is how we can help keep each other accountable so you don't get hijacked by those emotions feeling like you're going up.
Mm-hmm. A variation on this is doing something that doesn't make you feel good in the moment, but you think will make somebody else feel good. And so you prioritize other people's emotional experience over your own. And this happens a lot, actually. This is when a lot of people who use this process complain about not getting their needs met or always being sort of the sacrificial lamb. They're the person who's always taking the hit, and it doesn't seem like other people are willing to do that. And that's because other types aren't willing to do that. They won't do things just because it makes another person feel good if they're not using extroverted feeling as well. And so taking the hit is kind of a shortcut. You want to make sure that when you are using this process, you remember that it's not just other people's feelings, it's also your feelings. You're part of the entire, gestalt of the situation. And so doing that in behalf of others is an unsustainable way It's a synthetic way of keeping morale up. And I think there's a couple different challenges. We talked about extroverted thinking in the last podcast, just wanting that result and taking shortcuts and being willing to take shortcuts in order to get the result that they want, but the process isn't clean, right? And so it's not a sustainable result, or they end up really hurting people along the way. Extroverted feeling can also take shortcuts. There's a couple different styles of shortcuts that extroverted feeling can take, because their end result is that morale gets lifted. That's their end result. Or to not have to feel bad because other people are feeling bad. They want to be able to feel good around a bunch of people feeling good. And so some of the shortcuts are, like we just mentioned, being willing to, ignore the content of the situation and just focus on the emotional context. Another way is by handing yourself over to another person, as in like you're the person willing to take the hit all the time for other people's emotional boost. That's actually a shortcut. It's an unsustainable situation. You won't be there forever because you won't be able to take the emotional hit forever. You might be able to take it for a long time, right? That's kind of a superpower, is to be able to take those emotional hits in behalf of other people. But you won't be able to do it indefinitely. So only take those emotional hits in very rare moments. In moments where the emotional ROI makes sense, not in all situations. Another way that you can take a shortcut is that you might be upset with people that aren't keeping morale up. You might feel like somebody else's negative emotional expression or fighting for their rights is a selfish act on their part, because they're not taking into consideration how hard you've worked to keep everybody's morale up. And so being unwilling to allow other people to have their authentic emotional expression is one of the ways that you can synthetically create this high morale situation, but is actually not honest. And so that's also unsustainable. And there are moments when people who use this process can get very tapped into status. And I think one of the reasons why this happens is not just because it's obvious to them, but if you get caught up in a status situation, like there's an assumption that the higher status you are, the better you're doing and the better you feel, right? If you're high status, that feels good. And so there might be a desire to move away from people in low status situations because they feel bad. And if you're high status, then you surround yourself with people who also will be feeling good, theoretically, without remembering that people can feel bad in no matter what situation they're in. So there's just a couple different kinds of shortcuts that people who use this process can take, just like the shortcuts that extroverted thinking takes and the shortcuts that introverted thinking takes. And we'll talk about the shortcuts that introverted feeling takes. But these are shortcuts. So the focus really needs to be on authentic, honest, and actual true high morale. And that only happens through conflict resolution, not conflict avoidance. And this is one of the reasons why we decided to nickname the process Harmony. Harmony is not something that can be manufactured. Harmony is something that is grown through conflict resolution. That's true harmony. And so when extroverted feeling is at its peak and at its best, it's not only creating environments that make people feel good and make them feel calm and rested and comfortable, it also has an amazing ability to hold space for conflict resolution. It has the ability to encourage people to come together and talk about the things that are creating the conflict and help them sort it out and help them navigate through the terrain and hold the emotional space for the whole situation to give people an opportunity to actually come to true harmony. And when people are really good at this process, when they've really clocked their time, not just having this as a talent, but actually having it as an authentic skill, their abilities to navigate through conflict resolution is second to none. And in that way, they're actually getting people's needs met. They're getting the need met of us showing up as honest, authentic individuals without bumping against each other all the time and having it always be, like a rubbing up against each other in a bad way. There's a way of like sort of transferring this idea of friction into polishing that extroverted feeling really, I think, has a skill it's second to none.
Yeah, it's really shifting into seeing conflict as something that is positive. I think we automatically assume that conflict is negative in life. Not all of us, but a lot of times we as people see conflict as, we can't have any conflict. We have to avoid conflict. We repress conflict. Conflict is bad because it leads to fighting and other things. Yeah, when it gets to the level of maybe fighting or warfare between countries, conflict's not good. But conflict helps us create intimacy. With conflict, there's intimacy. There's refinement of ideas. There's actual true connection between people. conflict allows us as people to really actually get into the nuances of how we get along as individuals in this world. And so I think your relationship as an extroverted feeling person, if this is the process that you use to make decisions, you might be tempted maybe in your early part of your life to avoid conflict or suppress it. And as you mature, you're going to realize that it's actually something that's very useful for us as humans. It's something that should be seen in a positive light. It helps us refine ourselves and become truly intimate with one another. And I think that's the reframe that happens for an extroverted feeling person.
So let's talk a little bit about introverted feeling, or what we call authenticity. Again, this is used by people who are FPs in the Myers-Briggs system, and it's a very different process. Now, it still is focused on personal criteria. It's still focused on how things impact people. But because it's introverted, or its attitude goes inward, it's about how things strike individuals on a very subjective, personal level. So it's not personal in the sense of it's person-oriented. It's personal in the sense that it's like individual-oriented. Extroverted feeling is tapped into the collective. And there could be moments where you're tapped into single individuals at a time, but it always goes back to looking at the collective. Introverted feeling is the opposite. It's always looking at the individual. And sometimes it can zoom out enough to take in the collective, but then its natural tendency is, once it's taken in the collective, to go back to looking at the individual. So introverted feeling is about understanding how you feel about things. What are your emotional experiences? How are things striking you as an individual? How are things lining up with who you are as an individual?
So introverted feeling or authenticity is going to be interested in the subjective inner feelings of a person, the inner world of how this might be impacting somebody on an individual level. And like you said, interested in identity, like what does this mean as an identity? So identity is very important. Motivation, what drives somebody to do what they do? Like, why would somebody do that? That's really interesting. What internal in them, what were they feeling to drive them to do that thing that they just did in the external world? This becomes very interesting to introverted feeling. And it also is very interesting to them to why they do things. So what motivates me as a person? Why do I behave the way I do? What's going on with me on the inside? What emotions am I feeling? And it's really diving down into the nuance and complexity and the fidelity and the authenticity of each individual piece of emotion that might be going on for me, and weaving those together to sense of what would somebody have to be feeling to take that action? What would I have to be feeling? So the introverted feeling person says to themselves, that behavior out there looked really bad, but I think I could find the motivation inside me to have that same behavior. What would I have to feel to have that as my behavior? And then they find that within themselves and say, oh, okay, I would have to be feeling this way, this very nuanced expression of my emotion to be able to take that behavior in the outside world, which seemingly might look terrible to the outside observer, but you as the introverted feeling person understand that each of us have parts of us that have the ability to feel ways that we might act maybe badly or goodly, whatever it is. It's like we have all these parts of us that act out that way.
I like the idea of acting goodly.
Badly and goodly.
I think there's a question that comes up too here is, who would I have to be? What kind of person would I have to be?
Yeah.
And what kind of intent would I have to have? When you talk about motivation, I also think of the word intent. I think intent is very... I think introverted feeling is looking for intent, just like introverted thinking is looking for code. Introverted thinking, as we mentioned in the last podcast episode, that it's constantly scanning its own code, like when it's done well, like when it's not taking shortcuts, when it's willing to put the work in. Introverted thinking is constantly scanning for its own code to look for corrupted data. And I think introverted feeling is doing something kind of similar, but it's a lot less digital. It's more scanning itself to make sure it's always being true to itself. It's always being in alignment with itself. And this is complex. Just like with introverted thinking, there's a lot of code in your mind that wasn't put there by you. It was put there by somebody else. And there's a lot of assumptions we make about life that end up as code that we have to meticulously, those of us who are TPs, have to meticulously go through our code over and over and over and try to figure out, was this one that I programmed? Is it one somebody else did? Is it one worth keeping? Like, what do I do with this? Introverted feeling, it experiences something really similar. Some of this stuff, not some of it, a lot of the stuff that's put inside of us is from other people's beliefs and opinions and their worldview and their intent and their motivation. And so introverted feeling has to do something very similar where it has to constantly be revisiting itself, revisiting how it feels about things in order to determine, is this one me? Is this something I'm doing because I'm being true to myself, or am I doing this because I'm responding to somebody else? Have I handed my identity over? And I think this is one of the reasons why introverted feeling or authenticity can have such a sense of conviction around things. Once it's figured something out for itself, once it's decided that one is me, it doesn't want to let go of it because it was such hard work to get there. It was such hard work to determine what its own value system really is, that once it lands on one, that is a conviction. That is something that you will pry out of my cold, dead hands. But then I think just like introverted thinking, whenever it changes an opinion or idea on something else, it's got to go back to every piece, every data piece or every belief or every perspective that's attached to it. I think introverted feeling, when it's done well and it's willing to put the work into it, does something very similar. Anytime there's a major shift inside of introverted feeling to understand itself in a new light, it's got to go back into everything. It's got to go reevaluate all those feelings and all those beliefs and all that intent. And it's got to figure out what it's thinking, what it's feeling, who it is in light of all of this new self-awareness and self-understanding. And so it can be a very slow process. Just like introverted thinking is slow because it's got to go through so many lines of code, introverted feeling is slow because it's got to go through so many experiences and so much feeling and so much nuance and expression. Once it finds itself, I think that's one of the reasons why artistic expression becomes so important, is because it wants to share what it's found. Just like introverted thinking wants to share its pure data, introverted feeling wants to share its pure identity, its expression of what one person can be with the rest of the world.
Yeah, I would say expression is very important to people who use introverted feeling. And this idea of the identity level, something that's identity and conviction, you can already start to pattern recognize, probably if you're listening along, to say, so changes for introverted feeling, whether or not this is the case for other people, I think it is, but introverted feeling knows this. It sees this. It's very visceral for introverted feeling in that most change is identity change. So when an introverted feeling person changes how they feel about something, because their identity and who they are is wrapped up in that can sometimes be very challenging, and it's a difficult process because it feels like you're changing who you are in order to accommodate this new way of seeing the world or this new way of making decisions in the world. So sometimes it can feel like a retching, like an ego hit or a retching. I think a lot of introverted feeling people have a very close relationship with their ego. It's very apparent to them. It's a very tender part because they realize that to change how they're going to make decisions means they might have to change the identity of who they are. And that can be painful for us as people. It's painful for everybody. But imagine that being something you're very aware of. It's so surface for you. You understand this on a core level. And it feels like to go ahead and change something feels like you're retching that apart, or that identity is having to take a hit for somebody else maybe, or it's not really truly you anymore. And that could be a challenge.
I think just like introverted thinking wants to have pure information and pure data, I think introverted feeling wants to have pure motive and pure intent. That's its end game. And just like effectiveness wants to make an impact, a sustainable impact in the outside world, an extroverted feeling wants to create authentic harmony and actually have people feel good about their experience through life. And introverted thinking wants to have pure data, information we can actually rely on and know is mirroring and matching true true reality. I think introverted feeling's ultimate goal is to have a purity of intent and motive, and to know that they're a truly good person. And here's, I think, one of the challenges that it experiences if it wants to take shortcuts, right? Like every single one of these functions has a way to take a shortcut. And if it doesn't want to put the work into it, because the thing is that none of us are a pure intent. None of us. If you want truly pure intent, you're going to have to go in and you're going to have to look for all of the corrupt intent. You're going to have to go through and figure out who you are. And I would argue that introverted feeling sometimes has a harder job than introverted thinking, because introverted thinking is looking for ways to clean slice things. It's looking for ways to pull, concepts apart and look for things that they've conflated together that aren't actually associated with each other. So part of its job is to just get really good at slicing and dicing. But introverted feeling doesn't have that ability because everything is sort of merged together. Your identity and how you feel about things and your belief structures, they're all grafted inside of each other. And so you don't have the ability to just kind of remove a piece of source code. Like you said, if you're going to change something, a bunch of stuff changes. Like your whole way of seeing things, your whole identity can change. And that is a tough job. It's hard work. It is a lot of hard work to introspect on that level. So just like all of us, people who are FPs can get lazy about wanting the end result before they put the hard work into it. And so if a person wants to feel like they're quote unquote a good person, and they want to believe that they have good intent and good motive, but don't want to put the work into actually ensuring that's true, knowing that it is a forever job, they'll just claim it. They'll just go, I'm a good person. And then they can't reevaluate all that stuff now. Because if they go in and reevaluate it, it might show that they're wrong. Like they see elements of themselves that they would not personally define as good. And so they'll just become convicted around things that are corrupt. Elements of their personality they'll get incredibly protective around because they don't want to have to go in and see, well, maybe my feeling of being a good person, my assumption that I'm good and always have positive intent, that actually might be untrue in some contexts or situations. And so what ends up happening is they end up projecting that feeling bad about themselves that they don't want to see. They project it onto the outside world. They blame elements in the outside world as being bad or wrong because they can't see it inside of themselves because they can't do the work to uproot it.
Or the inverse of this is you've been wired somehow, maybe through religion or your family structure. You've been told that you aren't not a good person at all. You're a bad person at the core of who you are. And so you start to identify, growing up in the religious household, I use introverted feeling. Growing up in my religious household, I was given the doctrine and this idea that I'm a bad person just for existing and I'm sinful and destined for hellfire just by nature of existing, nothing I did, just by who I am. And it started to wire me as an introverted feeling person to say, it doesn't matter what I do, my identity is bad and wrong by definition. And so I had to do a lot of work on the other side, is not being right all the time. And my ego did a lot of work to try to find ways to make that. It's like a double bind on this, so I could still quote unquote be right. I got really sanctimonious and righteous in my younger years and real preachy sometimes because I was trying to deal with my own inner guilt of how just horrible I was as a person that I was messaged with. And so the work I did as an introverted feeling person is to go into that source code and say, wait a second, am I actually corrupt to the core of my being? Is that who I am? Is my identity wrapped up in just how bad of a person I am at the core of myself? And I had to go in and rewrite that code and do a lot of identity shifting, which was tough because when you change one thing, like Antonia talked about, a bunch of other things shift as well, and it can feel like a retching. So one of those extremes I think can come from this in introverted feeling. You can get almost latched onto one of those trajectories of feeling like you're a good person, there's no question to it, or you're a bad person and there's no question to it. And I think the other thing that is a challenge with introverted feeling is there's a statement that I think really resonates with people who use authenticity or introverted feeling, is this statement that the more personal something is, the more universal. So as an introverted feeling person, you will really get in touch with how things impact you. What are your motivations and what would mean something to you? And that is a really good mechanism for you to basically move through the world and understand how people are impacted by things. However, that if you get so subjective and you use that as your only criteria, often what happens is you might move through the world and you might overvalue that when you're interacting with other people. And you start to see, well, if this was happening to me, this is how I would feel. So this must be how everybody feels in the situation. And it's a good metric for you. It's a good way to look through the world, but it isn't the complete picture. And if that's all you're relying upon, you're missing big parts of other people's experience. And I think this is a good place to piggyback into, or at least to pivot over into the differences between extroverted feeling and introverted feeling. Because of that, because of the subjective experience of you as an introverted feeling person, someone using authenticity, if it's so real to you, this must be how these people are experiencing this, because this is how I would experience it. Maybe you'll put something forth in a group, and maybe you'll create discord in a group and remove the harmony that's there. And that might frustrate somebody that uses extroverted feeling in that dynamic, because now you to the extroverted feeling person or the harmony person, it looks like you as an individual are putting your individual needs or your individual perspective and you're forcing it, you're jamming it into the middle of this social dynamic, and you're making everybody have to pay attention to your subjective experience above all other things, when that's probably not what's really going on for you. You're just expressing how this would impact you individually. And the extroverted feeling person might be reading that as you're trying to hijack the social dynamic of the group. So that's just one launching step for us to have a little discussion around the differences between these two types of judging functions.
Well, I think it's really similar to extroverted thinking and introverted thinking, where we talked about how extroverted thinking is more focused on the result and introverted thinking is more focused on the process. I think the same can be mirrored in the feeling processes. Extroverted feeling is more about the result. How do we keep people's morale up? How do we keep people feeling good? And introverted feeling is more about the process. How do I make sure that I'm a good person. I'm in a good place. I have good intent. And so they actually work in chorus with each other beautifully, just like extroverted thinking and introverted thinking need each other in a lot of different ways. So does extroverted feeling and introverted feeling. They represent two very important elements. We need to be results oriented and we need to be process oriented when it comes to how people are experiencing the world and how they're feeling. Both of those things should be on our radars. And they just happen to be focused on two different elements of it. But when they come together, they do such a great job. I'm thinking about my 40th birthday party. I just recently turned 40 in October. And one of the things I asked Joel was, I was like, I want a birthday party. So Joel's like, oh, great. I've never thrown together a birthday party of this size. So, okay, what am I going to do? So he called in two of our friends, one who's an ENFJ, our friend Holly, and Dan, our friend who you probably have heard on the podcast, who's an INFP. And the two of them together actually really, they did a lot of work, didn't they?
Yeah, Dan uses authenticity and Holly uses harmony. And yeah, they did a lot of work. They sat down and they planned out the experience. And it was interesting to see kind of what, in fact, I just talked to Dan about this recently, what they were focused on in the moment. Holly was very much concerned about making sure that everybody is having a good time. She was really concerned about the setting up of the rooms and the dynamic and where the food would go and the flow, the structure, the external structure of how everybody's going to be engaging. And she did a beautiful job in thinking through all of that. And then Dan said one of his things he was focused on was alleviating my stress levels for me personally. Holly was also alleviating this as well. It wasn't that she ignored that, but she was much more focused on the group dynamic and the setup. And Dan was too. He helped with that, but his focus was definitely making sure that I was able to help you and I personally. It was a very personal thing to him that you and I were able to enjoy ourselves and we weren't overwhelmed by all the people and all the logistics. He was zoomed in on us and our personal experiences there. So you can just see already how the two feeling types, introverted feeling and extroverted feeling, are focused on making a great experience out of this party. But what are they putting their attention and focus to?
And I think it's important to remember that each type or a person who's using each of these functions can go the other direction. Like a person who is using extroverted feeling can think about the individual human experience. And a person who's using introverted feeling can think about the group dynamic. It's not like you have a limitation there. But you're always going to have a tendency to focus on one or the other. And I've noticed that for people who use introverted feeling, when they're in a group dynamic and they've chosen to engage with the entire group, then it's almost like the group has its own identity. Very similar to extroverted feeling, actually. Extroverted feeling creates like a third entity, which is the group dynamic, but introverted feeling almost creates like an avatar for the group. They're still having a very personal relationship with the group. But you can also see how introverted feeling kind of gets intimidated by groups because there's so much to focus on. There's like so many different individuals. And so they have a tendency to gravitate towards like one-to-one conversations in those group dynamics. Whereas an extroverted feeling person might also enjoy the one-to-one, but they always have those tentacles out for how everybody's doing and has their feelers out. I think introverted feeling can have more tunnel vision when it comes to the one-to-one expression, and extroverted feeling tends to have more of a spread of attention. And so the same behaviors can manifest for both of these functions, but they come from a very different source or root.
This is part 2 of a 2-part series, I guess, talking about all the judging functions in the Myers-Briggs system, the judging cognitive functions. And one of the reasons why we go into this, this is just a little taste, like we work with this all the time. So we have this profiler training certification course that we teach where when you're looking to type somebody, when you're in a profiling session, a formal profiling session, or even an informal conversation, on an airplane or a city bus or just on the streets talking to people, and you're trying to determine someone else's type, one of the things that we really focus in are these nuances between these functions, because again, behavior can only tell you so much. Behavior can come, like we just talked about with these two, introverted and extroverted feeling. The behavior can often look very similar, but the reasons why that behavior is coming up can be different. And the reasons are really what we're interested in, especially getting type accurately. So as you go down your journey as maybe a Myers-Briggs enthusiast, someone that wants to get better and better at typing other people or at understanding how people tick and how they're wired, these little nuances, these distinctions, these are really important for understanding, I'm an introverted feeling. And so I was here to say, this is how you find out the motivation of people, which is something that's on top of my mind because I'm using introverted feeling. But this really is how you understand why people do what they do, what makes them tick, what creates the behavior that you see in the world, because all four of these judging functions could have the same behavior, but they're doing it for very different reasons. And that's why we talk about this in nuance. That's why we break this apart and compare and contrast these. And we teach our students to do the same thing because it helps you get fidelity when you're profiling someone. And there's a lot of power in it. So that's the extroverted feeling process, harmony, and the introverted feeling process of authenticity, and some of the distinctions between those two processes as they show up in our personalities.
And what about you? Are you an FJ or an FP? And how does it show up for you? Like, what is your experience using extroverted feeling? And what have been your experiences with people who use introverted feeling and vice versa? You don't have a microphone, but you can state how you feel about all of this and contribute to the conversation by going to personalityhacker.com. And underneath this podcast, you can leave a comment and let us know how you have, like, what have been your experiences. Do you resonate with these distinctions between the two feeling processes?
You can also join us over at facebook.com/personalityhacker. It's a community of like minds, people just like you. It's growing every day, getting bigger and bigger as people listen to the podcast and join that community. There are great discussions around these kind of things over there, around personal growth topics, around personality types, not just Myers-Briggs, also the Enneagram, the Graves model, and spiral dynamics. All sorts of conversations are happening there, and we're curating that to be a really high-level quality group of people that can help us move through life together. We can have each other's backs, refine ideas, be encouragement and support to each other. So please go check that out over at, again, facebook.com/personalityhacker.
And if you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. And if you're feeling particularly giving, you can leave us a rating and review on iTunes. That helps us out a lot.
Thank you so much. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast.